The silence was deafening. In the ruins of what had once been apartment building number 47 on Krasnaya Street, Vasily Zaitsev pressed his eye against the scope of his rifle and felt his heartbeat echo through the shattered concrete beneath him. The Mosin Nagant 91-30 in his hands was older than his father, its wooden stock scarred by decades of use, the metal parts bearing the patina of countless Russian winters. But the scope, that precious piece of German engineering he had taken from a dead Wehrmacht officer 3 weeks ago, that scope could see into a man's soul at 400 meters. The temperature had dropped to -23°C during the night. His breath formed crystalline clouds that could give away his position, so he breathed slowly, deliberately, allowing each exhalation to dissipate completely before drawing another breath. The frost had formed intricate patterns on the broken windows around him, nature's artwork painted across the canvas of war's destruction. Every surface in Stalingrad seemed to carry the weight of winter and death, the metallic smell of frozen blood mixed with cordite, the acrid stench of burning wood and melted metal, the underlying odor of decay that no amount of cold could completely mask. Through the scope, he could see movement in the building across the square, a flash of gray-green uniform, the brief glint of sunlight off polished leather. German soldiers, members of the 24th Panzer Division, had been using that position as a sniper's nest for the past 4 days. They had killed 17 Soviet soldiers from that window, including young Private Petrov just yesterday morning. Petrov had been writing a letter to his mother when the German bullet found him, the unfinished words still visible on the blood-stained paper that now fluttered in the winter wind like a grotesque flag of surrender. Vasily's fingers, despite 3 layers of woolen gloves, had lost most of their feeling. The cold was an enemy as ruthless as any Nazi, creeping through every layer of clothing, finding its way into bones and joints, making every movement a calculated risk. The rifle's trigger guard was so cold it could freeze skin on contact. He had learned to work the bolt action with mechanical precision, each movement rehearsed thousands of times until it became as natural as breathing. The sound of the bolt sliding home was barely audible, lost in the constant low rumble of distant artillery that had become the soundtrack of Stalingrad's agony. This was December 1942, and the city that bore Stalin's name had become a charnel house of unprecedented horror. What had begun as Hitler's ambitious drive toward the Volga River had devolved into the most savage urban warfare the world had ever witnessed. Every street corner had become a battlefield, every basement a fortress, every window a potential death sentence. The Wehrmacht's 6th Army, under the command of General Friedrich Paulus, had pushed deep into the city, confident that their superior training and equipment would quickly overwhelm Soviet resistance. They had not anticipated the fury of a people fighting with their backs to the river, nor the tactical genius of commanders like Vasily Chuikov, who had transformed urban warfare from a necessary evil into a deadly art form. The battle for Stalingrad had begun on August 23rd, when the German 4th Air Fleet launched one of the most devastating aerial bombardments in military history. Over 600 aircraft had darkened the sky, dropping 1 EUR-0 tons of explosives on the city in a single day. The bombing had killed over 40 Yauauern civilians and reduced most of the city to rubble. But rather than breaking Soviet resistance, the destruction had created the perfect environment for urban combat. The rubble provided countless hiding spots, the destroyed buildings created natural fortifications, and the maze of debris channels forced attackers into predictable kill zones. General Paulus commanded over 300 Zero-Hour men of Army Group B, supported by 500 tanks, 6 Zero-Hour artillery pieces, and 25 Zero-Hour horses. Facing them across the Volga were the battered remnants of the Soviet 62nd Army under General Chuikov, initially numbering fewer than 55 Zero-Hour men with limited armor support. The numerical disparity was staggering, but numbers meant little in a city where a single well-positioned machine gun could hold up an entire battalion for days. Adolf Hitler had declared that Stalingrad must be taken at all costs. The city represented more than just a strategic objective. It was a symbol of Soviet resistance that had to be crushed to demonstrate German invincibility. The Führer had personally intervened in tactical decisions, forbidding any retreat and demanding that every building be taken through direct assault. This inflexibility would prove to be one of many fatal errors that would transform Hitler's greatest gamble into his most catastrophic defeat. On the Soviet side, Stalin had issued Order No. 227, not one step back, which made retreat punishable by death. Commissars with machine guns positioned themselves behind Soviet lines with orders to shoot anyone attempting to flee. The choice was simple: advance toward probable death or retreat toward certain death. This brutal arithmetic created soldiers who fought with the desperation of the damned, men who knew that survival lay not in escape, but in making the enemy pay such a terrible price that they would eventually lose heart and withdraw. The psychological pressure on both sides was immense. German soldiers, accustomed to rapid victories and triumphant advances, found themselves trapped in an urban nightmare where progress was measured in meters rather than kilometers. They had conquered Poland in 36 days, France in 6 weeks, but Stalingrad was devouring their strength one building at a time. Letters home spoke of exhaustion, fear, and growing doubts about the war's inevitable conclusion. Many had not received mail from home in months, and rumors spread about Allied bombing campaigns against German cities, creating uncertainty about what they were even fighting to protect. Soviet soldiers faced their own psychological challenges. Many were poorly trained conscripts, some arriving at the front with no rifle and instructions to pick up weapons from fallen comrades. The average life expectancy of a Soviet soldier in Stalingrad was 24 hours for enlisted men, 3 days for officers. Yet somehow, impossibly, they continued to fight. Some were motivated by patriotism, others by fear of their own commissars, but most fought simply because surrender meant certain death and fighting offered at least the possibility of survival. In this hellscape of frozen rubble and constant death, snipers had emerged as psychological weapons as much as tactical ones. A single skilled marksman could terrorize an entire company, making them afraid to move during daylight hours, afraid to light cigarettes, afraid to show any sign of life that might draw attention. The Germans had brought their own snipers to Stalingrad, men like Major Koenig of the Wehrmacht sniper school in Sossen, who had killed over 400 enemy soldiers on the Eastern Front and had been specifically sent to eliminate the growing threat of Soviet marksmen. Vasily Zaitsev had not intended to become a sniper. Born in 1915 in the small village of Yelenovka in the Ural Mountains, he had grown up hunting deer and wolves with his grandfather's ancient rifle. His grandfather, a veteran of the Russo-Japanese War, had taught him that hunting was about patience, not marksmanship. "Any fool can shoot a rifle," the old man had said, his weathered hands demonstrating the proper grip. "But only a hunter knows when to shoot and when to wait." These lessons, learned in the vast wilderness of Siberia, would prove invaluable in the concrete wilderness of Stalingrad. Before the war, Vasily had worked as an accountant in the Soviet Navy, stationed at Vladivostok. Mathematics came naturally to him, and he could calculate wind drift, bullet drop, and target movement with the same precision he applied to balancing ledgers. When Germany invaded in June 1941, he had volunteered for frontline duty, initially serving as a common infantryman in the 1047th Rifle Regiment. His hunting skills might have remained unknown if not for a chance encounter during his unit's retreat towards Stalingrad. On September 20th, 1942, during a German assault on Soviet positions near the Mamayev Kurgan, Vasily had been pinned down with his squad behind the wreckage of a destroyed T-34 tank. German machine gunners had established a crossfire that made any movement suicidal. 3 Soviet soldiers had already died trying to reach better cover. As the situation grew desperate, Vasily had noticed a German officer directing the attack from a position 300 meters away, partially concealed behind a collapsed wall. Without orders, he had taken careful aim and fired a single shot. The officer had dropped instantly, and the German attack had faltered as NCOs struggled to reorganize their men. Captain Danilov, the regimental political officer, had witnessed the shot and immediately recognized its significance. Soviet forces needed heroes, symbols of resistance that could inspire the troops and demonstrate that the invader was not invincible. Within hours, Danilov had arranged for Vasily to be transferred to sniper duties and had begun documenting his kills for propaganda purposes. What neither man could have predicted was how quickly Vasily would exceed all expectations. The rifle Vasily carried was a testament to Soviet industrial pragmatism. The Mosin Nagant had been designed in the 1890s and had remained largely unchanged for over 50 years. It was not the most accurate rifle in the world, nor the most advanced, but it was reliable, simple to manufacture, and could function in conditions that would render more sophisticated weapons useless. The rifle had been built in 1924 at the Tula Arms plant, and its serial number, 91308, had been carefully recorded in Soviet military archives. Its wooden stock bore the scars of previous users, including what appeared to be Cyrillic initials carved near the butt plate. More importantly, the rifle had been carefully modified for sniper use. Soviet armorers had selected only those rifles that showed exceptional accuracy during testing, then hand-fitted them with telescopic sights. The scope mounted on Vasily's rifle was a PU-3 5X, manufactured by the Novosibirsk instrument plant specifically for sniper applications. The scope's optics were basic but functional, offering 3.5 times magnification with a simple crosshair reticle. Unlike German scopes, which often featured complex range-finding mechanisms and illuminated reticles, the Soviet design prioritized reliability over sophistication. The ammunition Vasily used was equally pragmatic. Soviet 7.62 6.5mm cartridges were loaded with a 150-grain steel core bullet capable of penetrating light armor at close range. The powder charge was carefully measured to ensure consistency, and each cartridge was individually inspected before being issued to snipers. Vasily carried exactly 20 rounds in specially designed clips, each cartridge wrapped in waxed paper to protect it from moisture and debris. He had learned to examine each bullet before loading, checking for defects that could affect accuracy. A slightly deformed bullet tip could throw off a shot by several inches at 400 meters. The process of preparing for each shot was a ritual that required absolute discipline. First, Vasily would study his target area for hours, mapping every piece of cover, noting patterns of enemy movement, identifying likely firing positions. He carried a notebook where he recorded detailed observations. German MG-42 position, second floor, northeast window. Crew changes every 2 hours. Machine gunner favors left side of window frame. Range, 380 meters. Wind, 3 to 5 mph from northwest. These notes were more than tactical intelligence. They were the foundation of survival. Camouflage was critical in a city where any unnatural shape or movement could draw deadly attention. Vasily had learned to construct hides using rubble, broken furniture, and debris that would be invisible to casual observation, but still allow him a clear field of fire. His current position in Building 47 had taken 6 hours to prepare, carefully arranging chunks of concrete and twisted metal to create a firing port that appeared to be nothing more than natural damage. He had even scattered pieces of glass and metal around his position to create false reflective surfaces that would confuse enemy observers trying to locate the source of his shots. The psychological aspect of sniping was as important as the technical skills. Vasily had learned to control his breathing, his heart rate, even his thought processes during the critical moments before a shot. The human body's natural tremors, imperceptible under normal circumstances, could throw off a precision shot by several inches. Soviet sniper doctrine emphasized meditation-like techniques borrowed from traditional Russian hunting practices. Become the rifle, his instructors had taught him. Think only of the target, the wind, the distance. Everything else is distraction. Weather conditions in Stalingrad added another layer of complexity to every shot. Temperature variations could affect bullet trajectory, with cold air being denser than warm air and therefore creating more resistance. Wind patterns in the city were unpredictable, with destroyed buildings creating unexpected downdrafts and crosswinds. Humidity could fog scope lenses, and snow could make camouflage more difficult while simultaneously improving visibility. Vasily had learned to read these conditions intuitively, making mental adjustments that would have been impossible to calculate mathematically in the heat of combat. The German sniper across the square, represented a new level of challenge. Intelligence reports suggested this was Major Koenig himself, sent from Berlin specifically to eliminate Soviet snipers who had become too effective. Koenig was a veteran of campaigns in Poland, France, and the early stages of Operation Barbarossa. His confirmed kill count exceeded 400, and he was known for using a Karabiner 98K equipped with a Zeiss Zielvier scope, one of the finest optical instruments in the world. German sniper doctrine emphasized technological superiority and methodical precision, qualities that had made Wehrmacht marksmen feared throughout Europe. But Koenig was fighting on unfamiliar ground now, in a city where the rules of warfare had been rewritten by necessity and desperation. The urban environment of Stalingrad neutralized many of the advantages that had made German forces so successful in open country. Range-finding became more difficult with so many visual obstructions, and the complex acoustics of the ruined city made it nearly impossible to locate snipers by sound. Most importantly, the Germans were fighting an enemy who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The duel between Vasily and Koenig would be decided not just by marksmanship, but by patience, cunning, and the ability to think like the enemy. Both men understood that this was more than a personal contest. It was a battle for psychological superiority that could affect the morale of thousands of soldiers. Soviet propaganda had already begun celebrating Vasily's achievements, crediting him with 225 confirmed kills in just 3 months of urban fighting. German intelligence had responded by deploying their best sniper with orders to eliminate this threat to Wehrmacht morale. The morning sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across the square, creating new hiding spots while eliminating others. Vasily knew that Koenig would be studying the same shadows, calculating angles and ranges, looking for any advantage that might reveal his opponent's position. The German scope was superior, but Vasily had the advantage of knowing the terrain intimately. Every piece of rubble, every shell hole, every partially collapsed wall was familiar territory that he could use to his advantage. Through his scope, Vasily caught another glimpse of movement in the enemy building. This time he saw more, the outline of a rifle barrel, just the slightest protrusion from what appeared to be a carefully constructed hide among the wreckage of a third-floor apartment. The position was brilliant, offering multiple fields of fire while remaining almost invisible from ground level. Koenig had chosen well, but he had made one small mistake. The morning sun would eventually reach an angle where it might reflect off his scope lenses. Vasily settled into his position for what he knew could be a very long wait. His body was arranged to minimize fatigue while maintaining absolute steadiness. His left elbow rested on a small sandbag made from a torn Soviet greatcoat filled with rubble. His right hand gripped the rifle stock with exactly the right pressure, firm enough for control, light enough to avoid tremors. His cheek rested against the stock at precisely the same spot every time, ensuring consistent scope alignment. The waiting was the hardest part. In the silence between artillery barrages, his mind would inevitably drift to thoughts he tried to suppress. He thought about Maria, his wife, who was somewhere behind Soviet lines working in a munitions factory. Her last letter had reached him 6 weeks ago, and he carried it folded in his breast pocket, the paper now soft and worn from repeated readings. She had written about the factory workers singing patriotic songs during their shifts, about the pride they took in producing ammunition for the front. She had not mentioned the 12-hour days, the dangerous working conditions, or the constant fear that German bombers might target their facility. He thought about his childhood in the Urals, hunting with his grandfather in forests so vast and quiet they seemed to exist outside of time. The old man had taught him that every animal had patterns, habits that a patient hunter could learn and exploit. The deer will always drink from the same spot in the stream, his grandfather had said. The wolf will always approach from downwind. Men are animals too, boy. They have patterns. Those lessons applied perfectly to human hunting in urban warfare, where soldiers followed predictable routes, established routines, and made the same small mistakes that would eventually cost them their lives. The sound of approaching aircraft interrupted his thoughts. Soviet Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack planes were making another raid on German positions to the south. their distinctive silhouettes clearly visible against the gray winter sky. The Germans would be taking cover, which meant König might be distracted for a few precious moments. Vasily used the opportunity to scan the enemy building more carefully, studying every window, every hole in the walls, every possible firing position. As the aircraft noise faded, he noticed something that made his heart rate increase slightly. A piece of metal, possibly part of a scope mount, was reflecting light from a fourth-floor window, not the third floor where he had been focusing his attention. König had been more clever than expected, using a decoy position to draw attention, while establishing his real hide one floor higher. The deception was subtle, but potentially fatal for any sniper who took the bait. Vasily made a mental note of the new position, while continuing to observe the decoy location. If König was using psychological tactics, then two could play that game. Rather than immediately shifting his attention to the real hide, Vasily would wait and watch, looking for patterns in the Germans' behavior. Every sniper eventually had to move, had to adjust position, had to reveal himself in small ways that a patient observer could detect and exploit. The temperature was continuing to drop as winter tightened its grip on Stalingrad. Weather reports, when they were available, predicted temperatures could reach -30 degrees within days. Such cold would affect everything: rifle performance, human reflexes, even the trajectory of bullets fired through air dense enough to distort flight paths. Both snipers would need to account for these conditions, but Vasily had the advantage of experience with Russian winters, while König was operating in climate conditions far more severe than anything he would have encountered in Western Europe. Soviet tactics in urban warfare had evolved rapidly during the battle for Stalingrad, driven by necessity and paid for with blood. The Red Army had learned that traditional military doctrine was useless in a city where the front line might be the ground floor of a building, while the enemy held the upper floors. Combat engineers had become invaluable, using explosives to create new passages between buildings, allowing movement without exposure to enemy fire. Assault groups had learned to attack vertically, fighting floor by floor, room by room, sometimes for weeks, over control of a single structure. Communication between units had become critically important and incredibly difficult. Radio equipment was often damaged or jammed, and messengers faced death crossing open ground between positions. The Soviets had developed an elaborate system of visual signals using mirrors, colored cloth, and even smoke patterns to coordinate attacks and share intelligence. Snipers played a crucial role in this communication network, using their elevated positions to observe enemy movements and relay information to assault units preparing for attacks. Medical support had virtually collapsed in many areas of the city. Wounded soldiers often remained in position for hours or even days before evacuation was possible. Many learned to perform basic first aid on themselves and their comrades, using whatever materials were available. Stories circulated about soldiers using vodka as antiseptic, fabric torn from uniforms as bandages, and heated metal as cauterizing irons. The wounded who could still fight often remained at their posts, knowing that evacuation might be more dangerous than staying in position. Supply lines had become another critical vulnerability for both armies. Soviet forces received most of their supplies across the Volga River, using boats and barges that had to run a gauntlet of German artillery fire. Many supply runs were made at night, with crews navigating by starlight and using muffled engines to avoid detection. Ammunition was so precious that orders existed requiring soldiers to account for every round fired, and weapons were often shared between shifts of defenders. German supply problems were equally severe but different in nature. The Wehrmacht had extended their lines far beyond their logistical capacity, and winter weather had made road transportation increasingly difficult. Fuel shortages forced the cancellation of many planned operations, and food supplies were often interrupted for days at a time. German soldiers frequently had to scavenge for winter clothing from Soviet dead, as their own uniforms had been designed for a war that was supposed to end before winter arrived. The psychological toll on both armies was immense, but rarely discussed in official reports. Soldiers on both sides were experiencing what would later be recognized as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, though at the time it was simply called shell shock or combat fatigue. Men who had been normal functional individuals 6 months earlier were now jumping at unexpected sounds, unable to sleep without alcohol, and displaying symptoms of paranoia and depression. Some had stopped writing letters home, unable to find words to describe what they were experiencing. Others wrote constantly, pouring their fears and hopes onto paper as a form of psychological survival. Soviet political officers worked constantly to maintain morale, organizing political education sessions, distributing propaganda materials, and arranging for entertainment when possible. Soldiers were reminded constantly that they were fighting for the survival of their homeland, that retreat was impossible, and that the enemy represented an existential threat to everything they held dear. These messages were reinforced by evidence that was impossible to ignore: the treatment of Soviet prisoners by German forces, the destruction of civilian areas, and the clear intention of the invaders to enslave or eliminate the Slavic population. German morale was sustained through different means but was becoming increasingly fragile. Soldiers were told that Stalingrad was the key to victory, that capturing the city would break Soviet resistance and open the road to conquest of the entire USSR. They were assured that new weapons and reinforcements were on the way, that the situation was temporary and manageable. But reality was increasingly difficult to ignore. The promised quick victory had turned into a nightmare of urban warfare that seemed to have no end in sight. The sound of rifle fire from a distant sector reminded Vasily that the broader battle for Stalingrad continued around him. Even as he engaged in his personal duel with Koenig, thousands of other soldiers were fighting and dying in similar contests of will and skill throughout the city. The battle had developed its own rhythm, with periods of intense activity followed by eerie silence, sudden explosions interrupting quiet conversations, and the constant background noise of artillery that had become so familiar it was noticed only when it stopped. Intelligence reports suggested that German forces were finally beginning to weaken after months of continuous fighting. Casualty reports indicated that some units were at less than 50% strength, and the quality of replacement troops was declining as Germany's best soldiers were killed or wounded. Equipment was wearing out faster than it could be replaced, and mechanical failures were becoming increasingly common as vehicles and weapons operated beyond their design limits in harsh winter conditions. Soviet forces were suffering equally heavy casualties, but seemed better able to absorb losses due to their larger population base and the psychological advantage of defending their homeland. Replacement troops arrived regularly from Siberia and Central Asia, often with better winter equipment and training for urban combat. More importantly, Soviet war production was finally reaching full capacity, producing weapons and ammunition in quantities that German forces could not match. The strategic situation was also shifting in ways that would eventually favor the Soviet Union. Operation Uranus, the massive pincer movement designed to encircle German forces at Stalingrad, was already being planned by Soviet high command. When launched, this operation would trap the entire Sixth Army in a pocket with no possibility of retreat, forcing them to fight under siege conditions that would be even worse than the current situation. But for now, these broader strategic considerations meant little to individual soldiers fighting for survival, one building at a time. A sudden movement in Koenig's building caught Vasily's attention. Through his scope, he could see what appeared to be a figure moving between positions on the 4th floor. The movement was brief and partially concealed, but it suggested that the German sniper was repositioning himself, possibly in preparation for a shot. Vasily remained absolutely still, knowing that any movement on his part might reveal his position to his opponent, who was undoubtedly watching just as carefully. The art of sniper warfare required an almost supernatural level of patience and self-control. Both men were engaged in a deadly game of chess, where each move had to be calculated not just for its immediate effect, but for how it would influence all subsequent moves. Every decision carried life or death consequences, and there was no opportunity for mistakes or second chances. The margin for error was measured in millimeters and milliseconds, and success required the integration of marksmanship skills, tactical knowledge, and psychological strength in proportions that few individuals could achieve. Koenig had undoubtedly studied Soviet sniper techniques, and would be expecting certain behaviors and tactics. He knew that Soviet snipers had been trained to use rubble and debris for concealment, to take advantage of shadows and natural cover, and to strike during periods when enemy attention was focused elsewhere. His challenge was to identify which of many possible hiding spots contained his target, while simultaneously avoiding detection himself. Vasily faced the mirror image of the same problem, complicated by the fact that German equipment was generally superior and German training more comprehensive. Koenig would have access to better maps, more accurate weather information, and possibly even intelligence about Soviet sniper tactics gathered from previous encounters. The playing field was not level, which meant that victory would require more than just matching the enemy's skills. It would require exceeding them in ways the enemy could not anticipate. The waiting continued through the morning hours, punctuated by distant gunfire and the occasional crash of falling masonry as damaged buildings continued to collapse under the weight of winter weather and accumulated battle damage. Both snipers would be fighting fatigue, cold, and the psychological pressure of knowing that their opponent was equally skilled and equally motivated. This was not a contest that would be decided by a moment of superior marksmanship, but by the ability to maintain focus and discipline over hours or possibly days of intense mental strain. As the sun reached its zenith, casting short shadows and creating different light conditions, Vasily noticed a subtle change in the enemy building. The reflection he had spotted earlier was no longer visible, suggesting that Koenig had adjusted his position or equipment to eliminate the telltale glint that could give away his location. This was exactly the kind of professional competence that made German snipers so dangerous, and it confirmed that Vasily was facing an opponent who understood the technical aspects of long-range shooting as well as he did. But understanding and executing were two different things, especially under the unique conditions of urban warfare in winter. The destroyed cityscape created optical illusions that could confuse even experienced marksmen, and the complex acoustics made it difficult to judge distances accurately. Wind patterns were unpredictable, changing direction and intensity without warning as air currents encountered the maze of rubble and damaged structures. These conditions favored the defender who knew the local terrain intimately over the attacker who was operating in unfamiliar territory. A series of explosions somewhere to the southeast suggested that Soviet artillery was conducting another bombardment of German positions, possibly in preparation for an infantry assault. The sound would mask any noise that might reveal a sniper's position, creating a brief window of opportunity for movement or repositioning. Both Koenig and Vasily would be aware of this tactical consideration, and both would be calculating whether the potential advantage of a new position was worth the risk of movement. Vasily decided to remain in place, trusting that his current hide was superior to anything he could establish quickly under combat conditions. His position offered excellent fields of fire, multiple escape routes, and concealment that had been carefully planned and executed over many hours. Moving to a new position would require exposing himself to enemy observation, and there was no guarantee that a new location would offer any significant advantage. Instead, he focused on reading his opponent's behavior and looking for patterns that might reveal weaknesses or opportunities. Every professional sniper developed habits and preferences that could be detected and exploited by a sufficiently observant enemy. Some favored certain types of positions, others had preferred shooting times based on light conditions, and many had unconscious routines that they followed without realizing how predictable they had become. The afternoon brought new challenges as the temperature continued to drop and snow began to fall. The snowflakes were small and dry, driven by a wind that seemed to change direction every few minutes. This weather would make long-range shooting more difficult by reducing visibility and creating air currents that could deflect bullets unpredictably. Both snipers would need to account for these conditions, but the advantage might slightly favor whichever marksman was more experienced with winter combat. Vasily had grown up in conditions similar to this, hunting in forests where snow and wind were constant factors that required intuitive adjustments rather than calculated corrections. His grandfather had taught him to feel the wind rather than trying to measure it, to understand how weather affected not just bullet trajectory, but also animal behavior and human psychology. These lessons were directly applicable to hunting humans in urban terrain, where environmental factors could be as important as marksmanship skills. The falling snow was beginning to accumulate on horizontal surfaces, creating new visual references that could help with range estimation, but also new camouflage opportunities for both snipers. A skilled marksman could use natural snowfall to mask movement, or to create false targets that might draw enemy fire and reveal their position. The changing conditions meant that both Koenig and Vasily would need to continuously reassess their tactical situation and adapt their strategies accordingly. As evening approached, the light began to fade rapidly in the way characteristic of winter in northern latitudes. The brief daylight hours meant that most sniper activity would be concentrated into a relatively narrow time window when visibility was adequate for long-range shooting, but shadows still provided concealment opportunities. Both men would be acutely aware that their contest might need to be resolved within the next few hours, or postponed until the following day. The prospect of spending the night in position was daunting, but not impossible. Soviet snipers had been trained for extended operations in harsh conditions, and Vasily carried emergency rations and additional ammunition that would allow him to remain operational for up to 72 hours if necessary. The challenge would be maintaining alertness and physical readiness while fighting off hypothermia and fatigue in sub-freezing temperatures with minimal shelter. A sudden muzzle flash from the German building was followed immediately by the crack of a high-velocity rifle bullet passing overhead. Koenig had fired, probably at a target of opportunity rather than at Vasily's position, but the shot revealed crucial information about his location and weapon. The sound signature suggested a Mauser K98K, confirming intelligence reports about the weapon Koenig preferred. More importantly, the muzzle flash had been visible for just a split second from a fourth-floor window, giving Vasily a precise fix on his opponent's position. The shot had been fired at a Soviet soldier who was moving between positions about 200 meters to Vasily's left. Through his scope, he could see the man had been hit and was attempting to crawl to cover, leaving a trail of blood on the snow-covered rubble. The shot demonstrated Koenig's skill. It had been a difficult target, partially concealed and moving, engaged successfully at a range of approximately 350 meters in deteriorating light conditions. But the shot had also been a tactical error. Koenig had revealed his exact position for a target that was not strategically important, sacrificing the concealment that was his primary advantage in order to add another kill to his tally. Professional snipers were taught to prioritize targets based on military value rather than opportunity, and to never compromise their mission for personal satisfaction. The German had made a human mistake that might prove fatal. Vasily now knew exactly where Koenig was positioned and could begin planning his shot accordingly. The range was approximately 400 meters, well within his capability, but the angle was challenging due to the difference in elevation between the buildings. Wind conditions were variable but seemed to be diminishing as evening settled over the city. Most importantly, he knew that Koenig was using a window position that limited his fields of fire and would make it difficult for him to change position quickly. The ethical dimension of sniper warfare was something that most soldiers tried not to think about, but in the quiet moments between action, it was impossible to avoid entirely. Vasily had killed 225 human beings over the past 3 months, each one a person with their own thoughts, fears, hopes, and families. The propaganda emphasized that these were enemies of the Soviet state, invaders who had come to enslave or kill his people. But they were still human beings, whose lives he had ended with calculated precision. Some soldiers dealt with this psychological burden by dehumanizing their enemies, thinking of them as targets rather than people. Others focused on the military necessity of their actions, the lives that would be saved by eliminating enemy soldiers. A few embraced the role of killer entirely, finding satisfaction or even pleasure in the exercise of lethal power. Vasily had tried all of these approaches but found that none of them provided complete psychological protection from the weight of his actions. What sustained him was a deeper understanding of the strategic situation and his role within it. Every enemy soldier he killed was one less threat to Soviet civilians, one less gun pointed at his comrades, one less obstacle to the eventual victory that would end this nightmare. His actions were not murder but warfare, not personal violence, but professional duty. This distinction was crucial to maintaining his sanity and effectiveness in a role that required him to kill other human beings on a regular basis. Koenig undoubtedly struggled with similar psychological challenges, though German military culture approached these issues differently than Soviet doctrine. Wehrmacht training emphasized duty, honor, and professional competence, but also included ideological components that portrayed the war in the East as a struggle for racial survival. German soldiers were taught that Slavic peoples were inherently inferior and that harsh measures were necessary to establish German dominance. These beliefs might make killing easier, but could also create psychological problems when reality conflicted with ideology. The light was continuing to fade rapidly, and soon both snipers would face the choice of attempting a shot in marginal visibility or waiting until the following day. Night fighting was possible but extremely difficult, requiring different skills and techniques than daylight operations. Most snipers preferred to avoid night engagements unless absolutely necessary, since the reduced visibility eliminated many of the advantages that made long-range shooting effective. Vasily had to make his decision quickly. Koenig's position was clearly identified, the range and angle were within his capabilities, and wind conditions were acceptable. Waiting until tomorrow would mean starting over, giving the German sniper time to relocate and establish a new hide that might be more difficult to detect. The tactical situation would likely be different tomorrow, possibly with different weather conditions or changes in the broader battle that could affect their duel. The mechanics of the shot itself would require absolute precision. Vasily would need to account for the bullet drop over 400 meters, the slight crosswind that was still detectable, and the fact that his target was positioned at a higher elevation. The mathematical calculations were complex, but years of hunting and months of combat had given him an intuitive understanding of how these factors would affect bullet trajectory. His grandfather had been right. Successful shooting was as much about feeling as thinking. Settling into his final firing position, Vasily controlled his breathing and heart rate while making micro-adjustments to his rifle's position. The crosshairs in his scope settled on the window where Koenig's muzzle flash had been visible, and he waited for any sign of movement that would confirm his target's exact location. The German sniper would be visible for only a split second when he moved to take his own shot, and Vasily would have to recognize the opportunity and react instantly. The silence stretched on, broken only by distant artillery fire and the whisper of wind through the ruins. Both men were locked in a contest of patience and nerve that could last hours or end in seconds. Whoever moved first would have the advantage of initiative, but would also expose themselves to their opponent's fire. The psychological pressure was enormous, knowing that the slightest mistake would be fatal, and that success required maintaining perfect focus under conditions that would test the limits of human endurance. A slight movement in the target window caught Vasily's attention. Koenig was adjusting his position, possibly in response to changing light conditions or in preparation for his own shot. The movement was minimal, but enough to confirm the German's exact location within the window frame. Vasily held his breath, applied steady pressure to the trigger, and felt the rifle recoil against his shoulder as the shot fired. The bullet crossed the 400 meters between buildings in less than half a second. Its trajectory slightly curved due to gravity and wind resistance, but still accurate enough to find its target. Through his scope, Vasily saw Koenig's rifle barrel suddenly tilt downward and disappear from view, confirming that his shot had found its mark. The Ghost of Stalingrad had eliminated another threat to his comrades and added another chapter to a legend that would outlive the war itself. The immediate aftermath of the shot required careful attention to tactical considerations. Koenig might have been wounded rather than killed, which would mean that other German soldiers would soon arrive to investigate or provide medical assistance. Vasily needed to evacuate his position quickly and move to a predetermined alternate location where he could observe the results of his shot and prepare for possible follow-up engagements. The impact of this victory would extend far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Soviet propaganda would celebrate the elimination of Koenig as proof that German claims of superiority were false, that Soviet soldiers could match and defeat the enemy's best efforts. German morale would suffer correspondingly, as word spread that their legendary sniper had been killed by a Russian marksman using inferior equipment. These psychological effects would influence thousands of soldiers on both sides and contribute to the gradually shifting balance of the battle for Stalingrad. As Vasily carefully gathered his equipment and prepared to move, he reflected on the broader meaning of his actions. In 3 months of urban warfare, he had eliminated 225 enemy soldiers and had become a symbol of Soviet resistance that inspired his comrades and terrified his enemies. But more than that, he had demonstrated that individual skill and determination could make a difference even in the largest and most complex military operations in human history. The battle for Stalingrad would continue for many more weeks, with victory ultimately going to Soviet forces through a combination of superior strategy, massive reinforcements, and the gradual collapse of German supply lines. But the individual duels fought by soldiers like Vasily had contributed to that victory by maintaining morale, eliminating key enemy personnel, and proving that the Wehrmacht was not invincible. The Ghost of Stalingrad had played his part in one of history's most decisive battles, and his legend would inspire future generations of soldiers defending their homeland against invasion.